All right, so welcome to the Federalist Papers in 10 minutes or slightly more. This is the longest one, so it's going to be really hard to keep it to 10 minutes, and it's actually not a Federalist paper. This is the one anti-Federalist paper that the College Board has deemed important enough for you to know for the AP test. Most people know, thanks to a certain Tony Award-winning musical called Hamilton, about the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers were published in a New York State newspaper to try to convince people to get behind the Constitution. The Anti-Federalist Papers, otherwise known as the Brutus Papers, there were 16 of them. You probably don't know that much about them because there was not a Tony Award-winning musical called Yates. All right, there was one called Hamilton. These were most likely written by a guy named Robert Yates, who is a judge, and this is one of 16 responses to the Federalist Papers. It's a rebuttal of the Federalist Papers. Thank goodness you don't need to know all 16. You only need to know one, and that is the first one, so it's called Brutus I. So while the Federalist Papers were written under the pseudonym Publius, the Anti-Federalist Papers were written under the pseudonym Brutus, so hence Brutus I. This is the only anti-federalist paper you're going to need to know for the AP test because it pretty much lays out the entire anti-federalist argument. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically, this is going to affect the happiness or misery of future generations, and so we are really invested in the result. Brutus really rambles, all right? So here on page 2, he finally starts getting into the meat of his argument. He says, "Now, the most important question that was ever proposed to your decision or to the decision of any people under heaven is before you. And if the Constitution offered to your acceptance be a wise one, is calculated to preserve the invaluable blessings of liberty." This is the question we all must decide on. And we are trying to convince other delegates on which way to vote. All right? He's saying here that we need to preserve liberty. Okay? That you may rejoice in the prospects of vast extended continent becoming filled with free men. We have to preserve liberty or else. Because he says, if on the other hand, this form of government contains principles that lead to the subversion of liberty, that if this document doesn't preserve liberty, if it doesn't do what it sets out to do, if it's full of holes that will allow us to fall back into an aristocracy, that's where this American experience of liberty dies. We don't want liberty to die, and we think that this Constitution is going to cause liberty to die. Okay? First question is, should we continue as a confederation, a confederate form of government, so a loosely aligned union of independent states, or should we unify into one big government? All right? He says that this government reported by the convention is not all powerful, but it could be. All right, down here, he says that the last clause of Section 8 in Article 1 is the necessary and proper clause, otherwise known as the elastic clause. And if you don't remember anything else from this paper, just know that Robert Yates hates the elastic clause. All right, the elastic clause says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. Oh my. So that is the elastic clause. He also hates the supremacy clause. The laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. That's the supremacy clause. So, Constitution's the supreme law of the land is the supremacy clause. The elastic clause, which is called so because it stretches the powers of the federal government, is that the legislature can make any laws necessary and proper to carrying out the powers that are contained in the Constitution. Right? He says that this imposes on states' rights. He says that the government then, so far as they are to the government, so far as it extends, is a complete one and not a confederation. Again, we're getting rid of the rights of the states to govern themselves. Why are we doing this? Now they're giving themselves absolute and perfect powers to make and execute all laws. What's that all about? So far as the powers reach, the ideas of confederation are given up. All right, why are we giving up the idea of a confederation? That was not the plan. All right, he's saying that if this document, if this government has the power to annihilate all individual powers of the states through the elastic clause and through the supremacy clause. All right, he's saying that there is no actual limitation on the power of the federal government because it has the power to lay taxes, duties, imposts, excises. There's no limitation unless it's said that they don't have power to decide where it's applied, except that they do. By this clause, they're able to be applied to pay the debts, provide for common defense, and general welfare of the United States. All these things are subjective. The government can decide what all of these mean. So they lay taxes, duties, exploit. There's no limitation in the power of the legislature. All right. So it gives, this document gives Congress the power to levy taxes and then to decide what those taxes are supposed to be used for, because they get to be used for anything that's necessary and proper, anything necessary to use the money for. And then they gave the Congress power to raise taxes again. So on the next page, they say that the states have no say in this power whatsoever. If the government wants to take more power away from the states have no say in it. He says there that because the government has taken all powers of taxing, they can raise taxes whenever they want to, that the states can't pass anything but direct taxes. They can't tax imports, they can't tax exports. That's only Congress, the U.S. Congress, that can do that. The only thing the states can tax now is direct taxes, so property taxes and things like that. So if the federal government raises taxes beyond a reasonable level, what's left for the states to raise taxes on? And how can the states hope to carry on their own functions of government if their citizens don't have enough money to pay taxes? This can get out of hand so easily, and it needs to be reined in. All right. The lack of taxing power will dwindle the states. The states will dwindle away without money because they can't be supported. All right. Next, the federal courts. The Supreme Court is too powerful. Why? Is because the federal courts are supreme to the state courts. The state courts have to follow the federal courts, but the federal courts don't have to follow the state courts, and so the federal courts will end up taking away the authority of the state courts. What authority does a state court have if their laws are subject to the law of the state? It doesn't make any sense, Yates argues. So the judicial branch has too much power. All right. Here, next is the elastic clause again. Like I said, he absolutely hates the elastic clause. The powers given by this article are very general and comprehensive. All right. It can be used to justify anything. What's to stop them to say that entirely abolishing state legislatures is necessary and proper? All right. He says here in an example, suppose the legislature should pass a law to raise money to support their government, but then the Congress says, no, we have to abolish the state legislature now because that's necessary and proper to raise our own taxes. Your taxes are just clogging down the wheel of unity in the country, and so now in order to carry out our own duties, it's necessary and proper to abolish state governments. The necessary and proper clause can be applied to anything. It needs to be abolished. We don't know where this ends. It's so subjective. Go all the way down on the bottom of page 9. they've given themselves all the important powers. What's left to the states? All right, if they may do it, it's pretty certain that they will. For it will be found that power retained by individual states, as small as it is, will be a clog upon the wheels of government. If states are no longer necessary and proper to the government, what's to stop the government from abolishing states and just making us all the one united state of America? For states and their own workings must certainly be a clog on the wheel of government. Again, here's that idea of absolute power corrupts absolutely. Those who want power, every man, every body of men invested in power is ever disposed to increase it. The necessary and proper clause gives men in power the mechanism to increase their own power. Why wouldn't they take advantage of that, right? Down here at the bottom, should such a large government be allowed? Is a large government going to be sufficient to uphold the freedoms and liberties of each person? Whether this government that we adopt ought to be a free one, it should be so framed to secure the liberties. That is the key. We must preserve liberty. Is this government going to preserve liberty? That's the real question. Nope. It's too big. A free republic cannot succeed over a country of such immense extent. Why is that? Because one, he has some text evidence here. He quotes Montesquieu. He says, it's natural to a republic to have only a small territory otherwise it cannot long subsist. Trust the people who are smarter than us. All right, Montesquieu is way smarter than me, and he says that it's not possible, and guess what? It's not possible. We'll skip here. He also calls on on history. He says to preserve freedom, states must remain small because in Greek and in Rome, as they grew, as they took over more territory, their governments were changed from that of free governments to the most tyrannical that ever existed in the world. If you start grabbing up more land, you're going to want to take more power. And just look at Great Britain. They took all of this land here in America, and they got power hungry, and we just threw them off. We don't want to go backwards. We want to go forwards. Smart men are against the idea of a large republic. The experience of mankind are against the idea of a republic. All right, the best way to preserve liberty is in a pure democracy so that the people are sovereign and their will that they themselves declare might come together to deliberate and decide. To unite will be to lose your voice. All right, how can democracy be preserved in such a big republic? Democracy lies in the voice of the people, and if the body of people is too big, one person's voice is going to get drowned out. That's one reason we should not unite. Another reason we should not unite is because if we unite, then our representatives are going to represent such a vast number of people. The people don't declare consent by themselves in person, but by representatives who are supposed to know the minds of their constituents. How is a representative going to know the minds of their constituents if they have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands constituents? They're not. It's impossible. If the reps don't know the will of their constituents, then what kind of democracy is this? All right, the size of this country cannot be that big. Consolidation would mean that representatives represent too many people, okay? And then finally, in such a big republic, here down on page 14, in such a big republic, how is it that the diversity of interests will ensure liberty? It won't. In such a big republic, diversity of interests is going to ensure that Congress will always be fighting. Congress will always be at odds. Nothing will ever get done. How can one government speak for such a multiplicity of interests? All right. Down finally, his final point here on page 16. Nope. Just kidding. This is a long document. This is the longest one, and I'm already way over 10 minutes. I am so sorry. All right. On page 17, we're going to skip way ahead to 17. All right. Oh, here we go. So, the people in Georgia and New Hampshire would not know one another's mind. All right, respect of the law comes from respect of the rulers. In a large country, how can we possibly know our rulers and how the law will be enforced? All right, if a law is passed that makes sense for one state, Georgia, it might not make sense for New Hampshire. Why should people in New Hampshire have to follow a law that doesn't make sense for them? Because the people of Georgia were able to convince everybody to pass that law. All right, it doesn't make sense. Enforcement's going to be a nightmare. And if this new constitution is supposed to consolidate the 13 states and try to speak for everybody in the multiplicity of interests, it's not going to do that. What we need to do is keep the power in the individual states so that the laws passed can make sense for them, and so that the representatives can actually know their constituents, and that the body of laws will actually make sense for the interests of the people in that state, rather than trying to pass blanket laws that don't make sense for most of the population, but that make sense for the people who were able to get those laws passed. All right, those are some of the main arguments in Brutus I. I encourage you to take a closer look at this when you get a chance, if you have extra time. So that was Brutus I in 16 minutes. That's my longest one, but this is the longest paper we have in this round of papers. So good luck. Happy studying.